one bucket rather than having two slides for it, and the reason again was the percentages of the pie. That's not necessarily true for you guys, but in waterways and dams maintenance for the group, that's only 4% of the total. In buildings and grounds maintenance, the average for the group is only 6% of the total. So this is the standard format we used everywhere. We threw it all on one slide, so I did it here too. But as it turns out, waterways and dams isn't much of an issue for you guys. You're right on the average for the group, and it's very particular to your particular configuration of penstocks and gates and valves. But given that you're probably as complicated as anybody out there, and you're dead on the average, and it's only about 4% of the total, what we really said here is it doesn't look like it's an issue for you guys, and it doesn't look like there's a lot of improvement opportunity either. The one practice that came out of waterways and dams maintenance that seemed to be of note, we don't even know if we can call it a leading practice, is we have an awful lot of the low-cost people who are gathering their gate and penstake maintenance together into clumps and doing it all in one fell swoop every 8 to 10 years, as opposed to constant year in, year out, let's do a few more gates, let's do a few more of this, a few more of that. That gathering it together into a project base at least was of note that that's one way that people are skinning that cat. And if you're not doing that, you may want to, look at doing it is that a more efficient way to do gate and penstock maintenance than doing a little bit every year. And that was only of note. We didn't even recommend it as a best practice. We just noticed that that's the way a lot of companies seem to be doing it. With that, I'm going to move on to buildings and grounds, because unless there's a question about waterways and dams maintenance. If not, let's talk about buildings and grounds. B&G maintenance represented 13.5% of Skagit's total costs and 12% of Boundary's total. There was a question thrown up that maybe that might be a miscount for Boundary, because Boundary didn't look right again, because a big percentage of that, almost half of it, was a non-labor charge, and it really made me wonder what non-labor charge would you have in building and grounds maintenance.
I wonder if they said they in lieu of taxes.
Yeah, they might have thrown in lieu of taxes in there rather than PA&R. And that's exactly what I said here is Boundary's B&G, the very last bullet, was driven by a very high reported non-labor cost. It was more than 50% of the total. Again, I put that on there. It looks like you need to verify that because it just didn't look right. Okay. Security, according to our definitions, really didn't belong in buildings and grounds maintenance.
Right. What I'm saying is
Yeah.
the boundary, you'll see, actually, you'll see if you go back to the charts of the accumulated costs, you would find that the security costs were having.
Okay, that might have been the problem.
Around 197,000. I mean, it cranks it right up.
Okay. That probably more rightly belonged in the support category. And that would explain it. So, I mean, that may answer the thing. And if that's true, then they're dead on the average, and it's not an issue for Boundary. For Skagit, it is an issue, and the reason it's an issue is because, let me talk about the numbers first. The benchmark average for buildings and grounds maintenance was $29.23 a square meter. We benchmarked this in terms of square meter of building space maintained. We recognize that the only thing you do in buildings ground is not maintain buildings. There's things like snow removal and stuff in there. But what we found is the highest correlating factor for benchmarking is how much building space you have. It seems to be the thing that is the fundamental driver relative to these costs. After looking at these for 3 years, it's the one we've settled on. The benchmark average for B&G is 29. Skagit's was $51.88 a square meter, $52 a square meter, which was getting up on the order of 80% more than the average costs. I said nearly twice, but about 80% more, or 80% more. And again, we're not surprised. We have a couple other stations over the life of the study. They didn't happen to be in this year that were in prior years that had camps, and where you were maintaining camps and all the associated stuff that goes with that, you're going to see a very high B&G cost. So really at the forefront, and frankly, I guess if you wanted one more piece of information, Southern California Edison was about halfway through a 10-year program to phase out the company-owned housing as opportunities arose, either by tearing it down as people moved away to the closest communities, which in this case was 40 and 50 miles away, or selling the stuff to the employees and letting them be responsible for the maintenance. But they were getting, Southern California Edison and their one company-owned camp was getting...
Place in history is going to be, as he put it, as the liberator of a race, and that's enough for me. As it turned out, with the help of General Sherman arriving in Atlanta at just the right moment, he did win re-election. But ultimately, he paid for the emancipation with his life, because the following spring, remember who killed Abraham Lincoln? It was John Wilkes Booth. Why did he hate him? Because Lincoln had freed the slaves. Theodore Roosevelt, 1901, became suddenly president after the murder of William McKinley. And he was the president of a party that was very conservative, Wall Street dominated, loved J.P. Morgan, as McKinley had, and they thought of TR as a radical and a cowboy. And so the political thing for him to do would have been to immediately tell those leaders who would be in the position of deciding who would be nominated 3 years hence, you know, you didn't know it, but I'm really McKinley after all. You know, you just didn't notice it. I'm a McKinley conservative in disguise. But what he did do instead, his first major thing as president, was to sue to dissolve Northern Securities. J.P. Morgan's big trust, the biggest in the world, had just been formed. He sent a volley saying, I'm going to go after Wall Street, made the leaders of his party furious, jeopardized his nomination. And the moment that I think sort of captures it is that on Election Day 1904, when TR was running to be elected in his own right, he voted on Long Island, took the train down to Washington, and there in the doorway of the White House was his smiling wife, Edith, and he told her, I've had a vision on the train, and the vision was of you and our children, and as long as we're content with each other, that's really all that matters. I want to be elected tonight, but if it doesn't happen, you know, I have these other things in my life. And he had these wonderful friends like Buffalo Bill and Rudyard Kipling, and he loved to box, and he loved to ranch in the Dakotas. You know, there was a large life there. It was not just politics. That's the reason why TR could go after Wall Street. Franklin Roosevelt in 1940, running for a third term, his aides told him, you know, remember, boss, as if he needed to be reminded, this country is 70% isolationist. They're terrified that you're going to take them into a war against Adolf Hitler. Stop talking about defense because it's scaring people. Roosevelt said in reply, there's a worse alternative to my being defeated, much as I want a third term, and that is I could wind up being the last president of the United States because unless we build our defense now, we will lose the next war. And he was absolutely right. Harry Truman in 1948 had to decide whether or not to recognize the new Jewish state. He was torn. He was surrounded by people who were shooting at him from all sorts of different perspectives. His Secretary of State, George Marshall, said, I'll blast you and maybe resign if you do this. Truman's wife, Bess, it turns out, was a bigot. I didn't know this before, but she did not allow Jewish guests in her home in Independence, Missouri, even when Truman was an ex-president. You remember the old talk show host David Susskind? He told the story that in, I think it was 1961, he was doing interviews with Truman in Independence, and you know, day after day, he finally said, Mr. President, forgive me for asking, but why don't you ever invite me into your house? And Truman said, well, David, you're Jewish, and this is Bess's house, and there's never been a Jewish guest inside. So that's what he was getting at home. On the other side, Truman had this very close friend who was his old business partner, the famous failed haberdashery store of the 1920s in Kansas City, who was named Eddie Jacobson. And he came to Truman and said, you know, Harry, I've never asked you for a favor, but my people are suffering. Please consider doing something to help them. Had a big influence. But I think maybe the decisive influence with Truman was, and I guess you'd expect me to say this, he was a history reader. It was very good for him. Truman once said, "Not all readers," and I am saying this in the most venerated place I could, the Seattle Public Library. I know that Deborah is not going to disapprove of this. Truman said, "Not all readers will be leaders, but all leaders must be readers." Wouldn't be bad to carve that over the doorpost of the, but the building is so beautiful I would not do a thing to change it. But Truman meant what he said. When he was a kid, when he was growing up in Independence, he had these Coke bottle glasses, very nearsighted. His family told him, we're too poor to replace these things, Harry, so you can't do sports. So instead, he spent his time in the local replica of the Seattle Public Library. Independence Public Library was not quite as large as this and not quite as magnificent. Architecture was not quite up to what you see here. Number of volumes was not as large, but of the maybe 1,000 volumes in the Independence Public Library, Truman said he read just about every one, and it's been almost historically authenticated. And the one he seems to have remembered most of all was the one that really came into his brain in 1948 when he was dealing with whether or not to recognize Israel. And that was, he remembered having read a 4-volume book that his mother actually bought from a traveling salesman, which was called, totally politically incorrect title, Great Men and Famous Women. The idea that women could not be great, only famous. The subtitle was From Nebuchadnezzar to Sarah Bernhardt, so had a pretty big reach. But the story that Truman remembered was the story of Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who had reassembled the Jewish people in Zion 2,000 years ago. So that gave him a historical framework for the decision he was making. And as I tell the story at the end of it, 1953, just after he was president, he was introduced by Eddie Jacobson to an audience in New York, and Jacobson says, "Here's President Truman, who helped to create the State of Israel." And Truman almost shoved him aside and said to the audience, "What do you mean help to create? I am Cyrus." "I," he said, "am Cyrus." It moved him deeply in his last years. And then John Kennedy. I write the story of John Kennedy and civil rights, and there's a picture in the book of Jackie Robinson and Richard Nixon. And so one might fairly ask, what is a picture of Jackie Robinson and Richard Nixon doing in a book on presidential courage? 2 reasons. One is I've got 2 sons. The older one is named Alexander, who was just 13. The younger one is 10 years old, whose name is Cyrus. And he has been lording it over his brother that he has a chapter in the book that's called I Am Cyrus. I've got to figure out in my next book how to create a book with a chapter called I Am Alexander, just so that equivalence between the 2 of them. But anyway, Cyrus, I said you could choose one picture for the book. His hero is Jackie Robinson, so that's one reason why this picture is there. But the other reason is perhaps a little bit more on the point, and that is that when John Kennedy was running for the Democratic nomination in the late 1950s, for a long time, the way he thought he would win the nomination would be by courting the white segregationist South. He went after the endorsement of one Southern governor after another, and this became pretty quickly known, so that Jackie Robinson was at a banquet that Kennedy was at in New York, I think it was 1958, and Kennedy said, come on over, Jackie, let's have a picture taken. Jackie took one look and turned tail and stalked away, wanted no part of JFK because he knew what game Kennedy was playing. By 1960, Kennedy had changed his tune and managed to get elected president with probably 80 to 90% of the black vote, promising that when he was president, he would end discrimination, he said, by the stroke of a pen. But by the spring of 1961, people who cared about civil rights were sending Kennedy pens in the mail saying, when are you going to come through on your campaign promise? And the fact is he didn't for about 2.5 years, because Kennedy knew that when he was narrowly elected over Richard Nixon in 1960, what really made the difference for him, he thought, was the white South. If you look at Kennedy's victory margin, one southern state after another, these were not civil rights voters or African American voters, these were segregationist voters, and he wanted them again in 1964. So he sat on his hands on civil rights until the spring of 1963. And what happened was that Martin Luther King had been creating demonstrations in the South to move Kennedy off the dime. Finally, by the spring of '63, there were riots in Birmingham, and Kennedy was warned by his brother Bobby, unless you do something, every city in the North as well as the South this summer is going to explode, and people will ask, why isn't the president doing something to get this revolution out of the streets and into the courts? So with huge reluctance, Kennedy sent this big civil rights bill to Congress to integrate hotels and restaurants. And he said, I think I've probably given up the election of 1964. I'm going to lose. But he said to Bobby, at least if we're going to go down, let's do it for something like civil rights. It's exactly what you would hope that a president would say. Belated in Kennedy's case, but in the end, did the right thing. Final story I tell is of Ronald Reagan, and I'm a registered independent. I stay out of politics as a historian, but truth be told, probably most of my friends are Democrats, and they were horrified to hear that Ronald Reagan was in this book, until, including close members of my family I will not identify, until I told them the reason why. And he's in this book because of what he did to stand up to many of his oldest hardline Cold War supporters to work with Mikhail Gorbachev to end the Cold War. Took guts. And as I tell the story, it happened largely as a result of three women, somewhat unknown. One was his mother, whose name was Nell. She died in 1962. She's described by almost everyone as a saintly woman who thought that nuclear weapons were immoral and essentially said to him, Ronnie, if you're ever in a position to do something to destroy these immoral nuclear weapons, I hope you'll do it. Stuck in his mind. 1981, when Reagan was shot, he wrote in his diary and told family members, I almost died, and I think God spared me to relieve the world of nuclear weapons. He was serious. And by 1984, Reagan had done a defense buildup, Star Wars, things were getting very dangerous with the Soviet Union. It was not known at the time, but his wife, Nancy, went to him and said, Ronnie, this is getting ridiculous. It's getting dangerous, might endanger your re-election. People are upset by this. And she got him to think of ways that he could begin to connect with the Soviet Union and cool things down. And she brought into his life the third woman I'm talking about, which is a woman named Suzanne Massey, whose books I'm sure you have here in the library. She's a wonderful person. I had an email from her just the other day. She's living up in Maine now. She wrote a wonderful book called Land of the Firebird. She wrote on Russian culture under the Tsars. And Nancy Reagan brought her in to see her husband, hoping that she could tell Ronnie about the Russian soul, how you connect with Russians, how you build trust. And so she went into the Oval Office for the first time, and Reagan immediately took a shine to her. A meeting that was supposed to be 5 minutes lasted for an hour, and ultimately she saw Reagan probably about 4 dozen times during his presidency, always saw him before the summits with Gorbachev, saying, this is what you say to Gorbachev so that he'll trust you more. This is what you say to a Russian to make him love you. She had a very important unheralded role, and the most interesting thing of all to me is, why did Reagan like her so much? A number of reasons, but one was she reminded him of his mother. It all sort of circled back. And so the final scene I have in the Reagan story is the end of 1988. He and Gorbachev had put in place really the foundations of the end of the Cold War, and they were meeting on Governor's Island off Manhattan, and they had their meeting, and they then stepped onto a platform for a photo opportunity, and all the cameramen were there snapping away. And I have a picture of this in the book. You see them standing up, and Reagan turns and is pointing to showing Gorbachev the New York skyline, and the last thing he points to is the tallest structure in New York, the World Trade Center, almost as if he's opening the chapter onto the next chapter of American history. And the way I end the book is to say that for any new president, as I hope I've made the point, you have to recognize how important presidential courage has been throughout our history. End of the Cold War, winning World War II, winning of the Civil War, all the way back to George Washington. And for any new president who doesn't understand that, maybe take that new president to Mount Vernon and show him or her the study where Washington sat that night I was talking about at the beginning, with the rain falling and the weather vane spinning, and he was so tortured by his new unpopularity. Or maybe even better yet, take that new president upstairs to Washington's bedroom, where I'm sure some of you have seen it. You can see the bed in which Washington died. And there he was looking, Washington was in 1799. While dying, he looked up into the kindly, worried face of his doctor and said 3 words that I think were almost, I'd like to think were a message to all of us, and certainly to his remote successors as president. And those 3 words were, "Don't be afraid." Thank you all very much.
Last year. TVA has one of the very best systematic things in place. When TVA brought a Florida Power and Light guy in 5-6 years ago to head generation, one of the things he was very strong on from senior management support was the idea of quality management. And the place they chose to implement quality management teams at TVA, one of the places they chose to implement that was in outage follow-up and root cause analysis. They've got a very strong process in place that every time an outage happens, a quality team is formed and has to create a report that evaluates what was the cause of that outage directly, and indirectly an assessment of what they think the root cause of that outage was. Was it underinvestment? Was it the fact that we delayed maintenance? Was it cycles? But literally every time a forced outage happens at TVA, a quality team has to assemble and look at that and come up with a report that has an assessment of what the root cause of that was. A very strong application of the quality management approach. And literally, it's like it's almost something like you would see in the nuclear business. It's a debrief team on every outage that says what was the specific immediate cause of this and what was the underlying root cause of this outage. Now, that's a lot of attention to outages, but because of that, they have extremely high availability on their units, and they have very, very low forced outage rates. So, in terms of a practice to look at, in terms of just focusing yourself, that may be the kind of thing you want to look at, and rather than putting it off to some kind of on-the-sidelines analysis, make that a mainstream event.
So what was the average investment per megawatt? What's the dollar figure?
Oh, that's pretty easy to grab out here. Let me grab that. Well, actually, they're right up there. At Skagit, which was in the 41 to 65-year-old side, the average investment per megawatt was $12,000 per megawatt, and Skagit was right at $12,000. It's right here. 11,915 versus 12,249. You're right on the average. But I might as well grab it while I'm here. I was going to say the spending profile shows that about 35 or 36% of that total is going into went into PA and R projects. Well, actually went into Parks, Fish, and Wildlife is what you gave us the objective of the project. So that probably doesn't surprise you, considering what you had to go through to get the license for that money got directed that way. But in the meantime, your accompanying percentage for generating systems was pretty low relative to the rest of this age group.
But, one of the things that's interesting about that half of our licensing costs are in flows that don't even have dollars attached.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me get back just to finish off. I want to make sure I don't lose that one. Let me get back to just to finish off to plant maintenance. Really, I guess just to summarize the plant maintenance part of the world, The real opportunities there are opportunities not related to cost cutting. In fact, you know, if I was looking at this as a manager, I might say, are we kind of underspending in the maintenance area? Or again, that might have been an undercounting issue because some of the things that are done in operations really count in maintenance in our scheme of things, some of the regular inspection tours and things. But ultimately, it's not a cost issue in maintenance nearly as much as it is, you know, how do we get our reliability up to be more akin to those segments?
It also reflects back to higher. Put everything in the pie and pick it out.
Prepared for balance reports, and I guess I'm kind of surprised that Skagit seems to have such a poor showing in this. And is it, I mean, do you think it's really ring true?
Yeah.
I mean, we've had a lot to find out.
I'll tell you one of the things we do. Yeah, one of the things we do is we don't rely on the NERC-GADS reporting directly because what we found out among our participant group is that people aren't all even capturing the data, let alone reporting it the same way. So what we decided to do as a group a couple years ago is just have everybody report every outage on their system specifically, and then we calculate them for everybody. And in doing that, what we found out is some of our people are not counting. For instance, Chelan is not counting their failed startups. So they're under-reporting their outage rates. Okay? Yeah, it makes them look better. It improves their availability a lot. Hoover was not this time, so what they found out was since they weren't doing it, they took a 4-month sampling period because they had never had a mechanism in place to capture failed startups. So they reported failed startups based on a 4-month sample, and they were shocked to find out how many failed startups they had.
Just since I left Lordville, I haven't considered him failed stuff.
Yeah. But I mean, that was an example of one of our participants out of the whole group who wasn't counting right.
Another part of it is also when you look at some systems, whether they run all the time or not. For example, the Niagara's are really good, but there's a reason that they, on a very low forced outage,
They never
still
shut
have
down.
some cycle.
Yeah, they never turn it off.
Never turn them off. But still, even so, I mean, if you look at everything, you combine it all together, you look at it as far as the maintenances, and they all reflect back to the forced outages, the reliability, everything, it goes all into one pie. Where are you concentrating?
Right. That's what it boils down to. Okay, the other maintenance, we tended to throw this in